Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all those connected from all around the world, and welcome to this Carnegie Europe event. To all those who have joined us, thank you. I invite you to ask your questions in our Carnegie Europe YouTube channel or on our Twitter account at Carnegie_Europe. My name is Olivia Lazard. I'm a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe focused on climate change, ecological collapse, and geopolitics. Yesterday, Working Group 2 of the IPCC published its latest report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. This report follows the one from last year, in which climate scientists issued their starkest warning yet on the breakdown of our global climate regime, and yesterday's report is no different. It provided the latest scientific consensus on the impacts of climate change on ecosystems and human systems. It tells us that we're running out of time to address the fundamental drivers of climate breakdown, and that climate transitions must urgently address two combined priorities: mitigation and adaptation, so as to, and I quote, secure a livable and sustainable future for all. Its key messages are unequivocal. Climate disruptions are happening faster than expected. They're larger in scope than expected. They are unfolding across the world with immediate and life-threatening impacts in climate-vulnerable regions and communities. And the IPCC also tells us that there is at least a 50% likelihood that global warming will reach or exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius in the near term, even for the very low greenhouse gas emission scenario, which we're currently not on. The report makes the urgency of good adaptation crystal clear. We're underprepared for what is coming and under-aware of the multidimensional and cascading risks unfolding before us. To unpack the significance of this report, I am joined today by one of its lead authors, François Gemenne. François is a specialist of environmental geopolitics and migration governance at the University of Liège, where he serves as the director of the Hugo Observatory, and he also heads the Observatory on Defense and Climate for the French Ministry of Defense. François, good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, Olivia. Thanks for having me.
Today, I'd like to run through a few themes of the report with you in a way that relates to European policy and climate responses, and quite importantly as well, in a way that relates to the Ukraine crisis. But before anything, I would obviously like to start by asking you what key messages from the report you want to convey today. What should we take away, particularly for policymakers in the EU and across the world?
Well, it is, of course, not easy to summarize a report which is close to 4,000 pages into a few key bullet points for policymakers. But however, if there were some key points to take away, I would pick those. The first one is that we need to speak of climate impacts in the present tense rather than in the future tense. And when the latest report came out in 2014, most of the impacts were still addressed as future potential impacts. These impacts have not materialized, and we need to speak of them in the present tense. The policy consequence of this is that there is an urgent need to develop adaptation policies when we face climate change. And I think that for too long, we've considered, at least in industrialized countries, that climate impacts would mostly materialize in the global south, and that we were, in industrialized countries, somewhat immune to those impacts of climate change. We've had a stark reminder that this was not the case over last summer and the dramatic events that unfolded in Germany, Belgium, Greece, Canada as well. But this report is here to tell us that those impacts of climate change are already there, and that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is good, important, but not enough, and that we need also to develop adaptation policies. That's what the first takeaway point. Second takeaway point is that there are limits to adaptation, and that there are impacts for which adaptation will no longer be possible, meaning that these impacts will result in losses and damages. And this is a new political segment in the negotiation, the fact that some impacts of climate change will need to be compensated for because there is nothing we can do to avoid them. That is also, to be honest, an admission of defeat. The need for adaptation is the admission that mitigation does not suffice. And the need to recognize loss and damage and hence the financial compensation is also an admission that there are limits to adaptation. And that is, of course, a very sensitive point in the negotiation. But that's my second takeaway point for policymakers, that there will be a need to compensate for these losses and therefore to provision the appropriate sums of money for these compensations. My third takeaway point relates to inequalities. A very strong point in this report is to highlight that the impacts of climate change can deepen inequalities within a society, because the most vulnerable typically will be hit first and most. But at the same time that the impacts of climate change can increase the inequalities within a society, the report also shows that an unequal society is also more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, because people are less related to one another, and therefore some key resilience mechanism cannot happen in a divided, unequal society. And therefore, there is a risk that we enter some kind of vicious circle where climate change deepens inequalities, and at the same time, inequalities makes us more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Furthermore, we need to be aware that some of the key responses that we are developing to address climate change will also deepen these inequalities. Very often, when we think about the technology that will be needed to curb greenhouse gas emissions, we think in particular to the wealthier segments of the society, and it is likely that the most vulnerable will not have access to these technologies. Right. And therefore, it is essential to articulate climate policies with social policies. Fourth and final takeaway point that I would grasp from the report is certainly the fact that there are some very dire human consequences to the impacts of climate change. And for too long, I think we've considered climate change as mostly an environmental issue. And we realize now that most of the key policy issues that will be discussed in the 21st century, be it development, inequalities, but also migration, displacement, agriculture, public health, and of course, peace and security, all of these major policy issues will be transformed by climate change. And that therefore the foundation of the international order will be shaken by the impacts of climate change. And we see this with the current conflict in Ukraine. And clearly this is also a conflict that has deep geopolitical roots when it comes to energy availability, when it comes to the grasping of energy resources, and when it comes to our climate future. So, absolutely, in a nutshell, 4 takeaway points.
All right, I'll take you up on the Ukraine crisis point in a few minutes towards the end of our talk, but I actually want to go back first to the losses and damages point. The loss and damage conversation at COP26 was a turning point. It was one of the moments when essentially, there was a key sort of turnaround during the 2 weeks of negotiations, and where there was a very clear standing point from climate vulnerable countries and the G77 countries, for example, to really sort of say, well, we cannot go forward with climate negotiations on mitigation without really looking deep into adaptation finance on the one hand and loss and damage on the other. Can you give us a quick sense of how you think this report is going to lead into COP27 and COP28 Yep. and into the Glasgow dialogue, which focuses specifically on the loss and damage question?
Clearly, loss and damage is the new kid on the block in the climate negotiation. And it is also, as I said, a recognition that there are limits to adaptation and that adaptation cannot do everything for some of the climate impacts of climate change. The problem and the sensitivity of the issue, politically speaking, is the fact that most industrialized countries do not want a specific impact of climate change to be related to a specific level of emission in a given country. And the reason for that is because they don't want to be liable for some of the impacts of climate change. So they're okay to say that global emissions induce widespread impacts, but they're not okay to say that the level of emission in one given country has induced that specific impact in another country, because they know that if they recognize this, then it might be possible for some countries to claim compensations before courts and tribunal, and this is what they want to avoid at all costs. And also, the reason why governments are so reluctant to this is because they know that this will be costly, and they're extremely reluctant to pay at the moment. Even the funds that have been promised at the Copenhagen conference in 2009 are not there yet, and therefore one can see why governments from industrialized countries are not keen on paying more.
Absolutely. There is one central theme in the report, which is essentially this notion of resilience, which the IPCC sort of drills into with some, they try to sort of define it in multidimensional way, and with this ability essentially to evolve with and through climate disruptions that are incoming. And it relates obviously to this question of adaptation finance, including on loss and damage. And there is, we've been hearing in the news a lot this notion that, well, even developed economies that have most contributed to industrial climate change or industrial emissions related to climate change also need to adapt. And we've seen that obviously with Germany, Belgium, Australia at the moment, the US, Canada, et cetera, et cetera. But let me ask you this. Can developed economies focus on their resilience without focusing on that of other regions?
It is difficult to be resilient alone. And what I mean by that is that in case my apartment floods, sure, I can climb on my chair and make sure that my feet are dry. But the problem is that if everyone else around me is flooded, what am I going to do standing on my chair? And obviously, I think that we need to realize that our resilience to climate change depends also very much on the resilience of the others, because we're all deeply connected. And we see, again, with the Ukraine crisis, how connected we are to each other. There has been in the climate negotiations a tendency to consider that adaptation did not require any form of international cooperation, and that each country could develop its own adaptation plan, and that the only reason why adaptation was discussed after all in the negotiation was to arrange matters of funding. I think this is short-sighted, and I think that we need to be aware of the cascading effects and of the cascading risks of climate change. And the report insists very much on this cascading notion of risks, on the fact that sometimes we will develop our resilience at the expense of the resilience of other countries. And this clearly will lead to maladaptation, that is, to adaptation that is detrimental and counterproductive in the long run, also for us, because we will suffer from indirect effects, such as the destabilization of some countries, conflicts erupting in different parts of the world, or mass migration that we wouldn't be able to organize. And I think that we need to be aware of the fact that our resilience also depends on the resilience of others, in the same way that our capacity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions also depends on the capacity of others to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. If we do all of the effort in France or in Belgium or in the US, whereas all the others increase their greenhouse gas emissions, then our effort is senseless and basically will be unuseful. Which is the reason why we absolutely need to stop thinking only about our own emissions, but to start thinking about global emissions. And you released last year a report. I mean, you, not just you, Olivia, but the Carnegie Foundation at large, released last year a report that showed that most industrialized countries were tapping into the natural resources of developing countries to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. But by doing so, they were also reducing the capacity of developing countries to reduce their own emissions. And at the end of the day, the climate doesn't care whether the emissions come from France or from Namibia.
Absolutely, and thank you for mentioning this this report on ecological diplomacy for Europe. I will also sort of revert back with a question on it in just a second. But I just want to dwell for 1 second on the resilience question, because I think it's really important for policymakers and for everyone at large to understand something. The report itself focuses on the notion of building resilience. It focuses on the notion of building resilience at the human level, at the community level, at the national, regional, continental level, and essentially sort of drives to the question that you were just mentioning, to the issue that we need to drive resilience globally. In a world where, on top of it, we have stronger limitations now to adaptation because of the emissions that we've already emitted and because of the climate disruptions which are already wreaking havoc on natural ecosystems and on human societies. So I want to translate that into something which I think sort of it needs to be captured in terms of language, and that is the notion of co-resilience or inter-resilience. The report tells us, and this is really quite stark in terms of number, the report tells us that over 3.3 billion people live in climate vulnerable contexts. That's about half of the world's population, which is concerned by increasingly dire and increasingly fast climate disruptions coming their way. So if we fail to act quickly on what you call good adaptation, and I'll come to this in a minute, and on effective mitigation, can you give us a sense of, like using one example, for example, Europe, the Ukraine crisis, or Europe and, African context, what does the report tell us about impending consequences on this notion of cascading risks and feedback loops within human societies? Can you illustrate that for us?
Sure. To put it bluntly, the impending consequence of this is the inhabitability of the planet. That is, our capacity to inhabit the planet we live on. And if we don't manage to align with the objectives of the Paris Agreement, then it is likely that some places of the planet, that some regions of the world will become literally uninhabitable because the temperature will be too hot, and above 50 degrees Celsius, it becomes difficult for the human body to perform its vital functions, or because some areas of the world will be flooded permanently. This is the case of a lot of low-lying coasts, typically highly densely populated. This is the case of many deltas as well, and of course of small island states and territories, or because agriculture will become impossible in those places. When you consider that in sub-Saharan Africa, about one household out of two depends on subsistence agriculture for one's livelihood, and when you know that subsistence agriculture is a kind of agriculture that is highly dependent upon temperature or rainfall variability, that means that quickly enough, roughly half of the African population could lose their primary source of livelihood. And this is likely to induce major disruption. And I think this is also one of the key takeaway of the report, is that it breaks away from a kind of deterministic logic that was still very much present in the latest report, and that assumed that the magnitude of social transformations would be directly correlated to the magnitude of climate impacts. And we show in this report that even a tiny little variation in the temperature or in the rainfall can induce major social transformations,
which are very often difficult to anticipate. However, with this kind of report, we're getting closer and closer to understanding this notion of cascading risks, right? Movements of disruptions in livelihoods, potential displacement of people, or migratory movements within different regions or across continents, and how essentially it may lead, political responses to be a lot more defensive rather than proactive. So the key question is obviously, also with this, with today's report, and it's not as if, it's contained, like it contains new information, but it's not groundbreaking. We know what's happening. We know about the urgency of the climate crisis. Are you seeing governments across the world being aware enough of the level of risks that we're incurring, prepared enough in analytical systems and in response systems, let it be for humanitarian responses, for management of different adaptation systems, for investments into nature-based solutions or nature-based processes, into technologies that can help us with mitigation aspects, etc. Do you see a change, not just in the awareness, but really in how awareness trickles down into government and governance policies?
I do not.
That's very damning.
I do not, because I am under the impression that most governments continue to view the risks associated with climate change as risks that would happen far away in the future or in faraway countries. And many governments do not realize, I think, how close and how present these risks are today in their countries. And this raises two questions to me. The first one is that we see that with the war in Ukraine, some governments are willing to change abruptly their energy policy or their economic policies in order to make themselves less dependent upon Russian imports of gas or of oil. And clearly, this is a good reason to do this. And I'm glad that this is happening. But I also wonder if they're able to do it now in the face of a major security threat. Why weren't they able to do so some 10 or 20 or 30 years ago in the face of a climate threat? And probably we wouldn't be in such a situation of vulnerability and dependence towards Russia if we had anticipated this 10 or 20 years ago in the face of the climate threat.
Exactly.
The second question that I am also asking myself is, what does it take for us, climate scientists, to be really listened to by governments? And what did we do wrong? And I think that we cannot avoid these kind of tough questions to ourselves as well. And I think it is true to say that many politicians or policymakers are not fully aware of the implications of climate change. But it is also true that many climate scientists and researchers are still a bit shying away from public debates and from engaging into public debates. I was struck, for example, that before the release of the report, of course, the IPCC press office distributed some elements of language, and everywhere on these elements of language was highlighted the need to remain neutral. Even when we were asked questions about the war between Russia and Ukraine, the IPCC asked us to remain neutral about this, whereas obviously it is a clear case of an aggression of one country by another. And I'm like, we have been so keen on maintaining a position of absolute neutrality that it might have given the governments the impression that the situation was not so bad after all. And government, if I were a government leader, I might say, well, look, if the situation was really so bad, then I think that the IPCC and the researchers would take a stance. I don't think that they would just stay neutral, stay policy neutral, not policy prescriptive. I mean, when the COVID-19 crisis happened, we saw most public health experts recommending policy options and telling governments, hey, look, this is what you need to do. And as climate scientists, we continue to shy away from this and we continue to remain neutral. And I think that this position of neutrality, even though I can understand the rationale for it, cannot really justify itself anymore now.
No, I completely understand. And I think that there is also an interesting aspect to this report, which is stating the reality of the climate crisis or climate breakdown, whatever language we want to use, and being unequivocal about this. and more vocal. But there's also the part where it's about recognizing essentially that adaptation and mitigation strategies, programs, processes need to be highly contextual in order to be good adaptation or good mitigation. There is also very much of this focus, which I was very happy to see in the summary for policymakers, that there is a recognition that certain indigenous knowledges should be wherever and whenever possible in the driving seat, that we need to really be inclusive about the type of governance systems, political and policy processes that really drive the implementation of adaptation. And before we move on to the Ukraine point, which I find is very important, I want to ask you about one piece of language which is really important in this report. The IPCC talks about, obviously, good adaptation versus maladaptation. And in good adaptation, it talks about transformative adaptation. It talks about the need to not rely on quick fixes, but really to rethink the way in which we do societal resilience, regional resilience, and global resilience in terms of systems. So what can you unpack for me this term, because it's quite a mouthful, transformative adaptation? What did the IPCC mean, and what do you want to convey in terms of how this should translate in terms of what is supported for good adaptation?
The first point, I think, is to make sure that adaptation is a process and not a state. And what I mean by that is that the moment you consider that you're adapted, that means that you're not. You should always speak of adapting rather than of adapted. And I think this is really a key point to understand adaptation as a process and not as a state. And therefore, adaptation is intrinsically a dynamic process of constant adjustment to changing circumstances. If you consider that adaptation is a quick fix, then you indeed run the risk of implementing solutions that will be counterproductive in the future. Counterproductive because they might hinder the adaptive capacity of some other populations or communities, or they might make you more vulnerable in the future. A typical example is that if you install air conditioning to try and solve the problem of heat waves in cities, with air conditioning, of course, you will reduce the effect of heat, but you will increase greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore you will make yourself more vulnerable to future heat waves in the future. And I think that it is extremely important when we consider adaptation to really take a systemic view, and therefore to think of adaptation for whom. And if some develop adaptation strategies, there is also a possibility that what is an adaptation strategy for some might be counterproductive for others. If you take, for example, the case of migration, it has often been mooted that migration could be an adaptation strategy. Sure. The question is, an adaptation strategy for whom? For the migrants, certainly. But the migration of some might also make the community of origin or the community of destination more vulnerable to other climate impacts, because typically the migrants will be the wealthiest and the youngest in a community to leave. Similarly, with the Ukraine crisis, we see that some countries are willing to ditch Russian gas completely, and I think this is the right thing to do, make no mistake. But because they have not anticipated this geopolitical risk, then there is a risk that they might do some quick fix by turning, for example, to coal from Poland or from Germany, and that would be typically a kind of maladaptive decision, because I understand that obviously they want to avoid blackouts. But if the cost for that is to reinvest in fossil fuels, that will prove maladaptive in the future.
Absolutely. This is a really important point. And I like the fact that you connect essentially those micro decisions, the air conditioning example, for example, with energy system adaptation. And I'm going to use this as a segue quickly to dive into the Ukraine crisis. I find your point really astute. The fact that it took an invasion, a war, essentially, to consider switching away from a fossil, exporter, Russia. We're not switching away in Europe entirely from fossils, but there is an impetus by now to, invest into renewable energy and to accelerate the transition by the horizon of 2030 towards renewables. It denotes one thing, and I'd like to highlight this because we're seeing it in our work at Carnegie Europe. One is, as you were saying, had Europe heeded IPCC calls 20 years ago and understood the relevance of what the IPCC was saying and the anticipation of risks to come, it is very unlikely today that energy systems would be weaponized and that dependencies would be, weaponized in the way that we're seeing. And, that the prospect of dealing with war with increasing climate disruptions, which weigh heavily on fiscal resources, it is unlikely that we would find ourselves in this situation. So this is part of the constraints that we're seeing in terms of adaptation. We're dealing with multiple crises of incredible magnitude, some related to biophysics, others related to geopolitics. And we need to be able today, and this is a key point for policymakers, to really integrate in a systemic way geopolitical, security, geoeconomic, and biophysical analysis. So that's one point that I'd like to drive across.
Yep.
Now,
that requires a lot of prospective thinking. And the problem is that in policymaking, typically, we are still in a very much reactive mindset. We react to crises rather than anticipate them.
No, absolutely. And I think that there is another learning essentially in what's happening. It's that geopolitics and climate transitions were never separate. It's just that we had not indeed understood the relevance of it. It had not trickled up in policy processes. They have always been intertwined, but I would even go as far as arguing that today, geopolitics and climate transitions are actually one and the same. And I want to apply this analysis to the Ukraine crisis. I'll let you run through your own interpretation of how the Ukraine crisis is relevant in terms of climate transitions and geopolitics at the moment, and then I'll add something. But let me first collect your thoughts on what is happening. What are the intersections between the Ukraine crisis and climate transitions at the moment?
There are many. I think we need to distinguish two clusters. The first one is how our dependence upon Russian imports has put us in a situation of vulnerability like this. And I think that, thankfully, I'm not in the head of dictator Putin, but I think that if he made the decision to invade Ukraine, is also because he did bet on the fact that sanctions against him or against Russia would be light, given the huge dependence of European energy systems to Russian imports and to Russian gas in particular. And clearly, if we had anticipated this some 20 years ago, I think we would have been in that situation today. Then the second point, the second aspect or the second cluster is the fact that obviously the war itself and the reactions to the war and the sanctions will have long-lasting impact on the energy future of European countries. First, because some countries are willing to completely reverse their energy policy, and that is the case certainly in Germany, but to a lesser extent in some other countries as well. And because some major investments in fossil fuel projects are being denounced and are being abandoned. We've seen British Petroleum, we've seen Shell abandoning major projects in fossil fuels. And maybe that would be a kind of game changer to accelerate either the transition towards renewable energies or possibly also to revive the nuclear energy sector, and probably a bit of both.
I completely subscribe to what you're saying. I'm also, to your point about policy anticipation. There's been a lot of talk about President Putin not really ever being sensitized or aware of climate crisis. I would actually tend to, growingly defer and disagree with this point. I think that we really need to look at the geostrategic relevance of Ukraine. It is one of the massive breadbaskets of Europe. It is one of the countries that have long been central to global food markets across the world. And if we remember, just before the Arab Spring, there were, a number of climate disruptions in Argentina, in Ukraine, in Canada, that actually led, to the price of food staples to skyrocket, which then cascaded, and we're talking indeed about those cascading risks, into a number of vulnerabilities across the world, and specifically in the Middle East and the North African region, which exacerbated, pre-existing grievances between people and their government. And then it took essentially just a series of events of the type that you were talking about to really ignite a social revolution and the complete geopolitical, change of map in the Middle East and North Africa. So there is, I think, and we've heard, President Putin say that he intends on having Russia benefit from the climate crisis by mainly opening up, new trade routes, new agricultural lands, and being a breadbasket powerhouse for the global economy in the future. And then there is another point, which I find, is really missing from the current conversation. In 2021, the European Union struck a partnership with Ukraine on supply chains regarding critical materials that are necessary for decarbonization and for digitalization. And this is a pattern of behavior that we're seeing more and more on the part of Russia to try and become a power broker, to try and sort of, influence and carve out spheres of influence essentially in the world, let it be in Ukraine, let it be in the Central African Republic, in Mali, to try and make sure that going forward, since climate transitions are accelerating and energy systems are changing, Russia can, be of influence in how other countries and other regions, including the European Union, will be able to transition and will be able to effectively transition and maintain, its democratic, its geoeconomic, its socioeconomic resilience in the face of climate change. And it falls into a sort of, strategy on the part of Russia and China, which is indeed about sort of, using supply chains, which are now connecting to how we regear the global economy in the face of climate disruptions, to try and sort of, carve out dependency relationships. So this is the part which I think, we need to drive more and more forward, this understanding that climate disruptions are going to have some cascading risks in societies, which are going to change the makeup of societies, which they need to adapt to. But it's also, that climate transitions are playing in the way, of how geopolitics are changing and how international relationships are changing, and how, therefore, there is an impetus for the European Union to really use a geopolitical influence to enhance this notion of co-resilience, co-adaptation. This is why climate finance is becoming one key aspect of the future, a livable and sustainable future for all. And we all depend on this ability essentially to redistribute resources and to use transitions as a transformative power for equalization and for equity across the world.
And the question, I think that full independence or sovereignty is a myth. And rather that the question is, who do we want to depend on? And this is where that the EU can definitely find a kind of new strength, because I bet that most European countries would rather depend on other European countries than depend on authoritarian regimes for this.
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 5 minutes left, and I wish we had, a lot more time to delve into the Ukraine crisis, because it's really of, huge importance, and I want to make sure that we understand that now climate and geopolitics are lenses that are one and the same. But I want to turn to a question by Anthony Di Grado. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the U.S. Department of Agriculture and in the University of Illinois, and he asks you: are there precedents of successful lawsuit against a government for failing at taking appropriate measures to mitigate climate change? And would you be in favor of such approach to prompt action? We have about 2 minutes for you to answer.
there is an example of a failed lawsuit. In the early 2000s, the small archipelago of Tuvalu in the South Pacific, which is really at the front line of sea level rise, decided to sue the US and Australia before the International Court of Justice on the motive of violation of its territorial integrity. And the rationale for that was that Tuvalu reckoned that given that Australia and the US had not ratified the Kyoto Protocol, they were directly responsible for the sea level rise that prevented, or rather that dented its territorial integrity. The problem is that as soon as the US and Australia found out about the lawsuit, they threatened to cut international aid to Tuvalu, and therefore Tuvalu withdrew its case. But that would have been interesting to see what the court would have ruled had the lawsuit gone forward. We see at the moment a lot of lawsuits being waged by citizens of different countries against their own governments. I think they're rather useful, but rather useful in terms of a communication exercise. They're a PR exercise aimed at showing and reminding governments that they've taken commitments and that they should be held liable for these commitments and for these promises. The problem is that at the moment, those who are really the victims of climate change have not yet sued those that they considered as responsible for the problem. If that were to be the case, I think that would be a very strong leverage of action against climate change, because that would entail real legal consequences. At the moment, the lawsuits we have on a national level are important, but are more communication exercises than real leverage for power. That might be a game changer if international lawsuits were to become the norm.
Thank you very much. So we have about 2 minutes left. If there is one last question from the audience, please write it very, very fast in the chat. And in the meantime, François, I'll ask you for maybe if you have one last word, one specific point that you'd like to raise. I know that I have a time, but tell me.
Well, it's difficult to have a last word, but I think that we should also reflect within the IPCC as to how we want to communicate in the future. I mean, right. The sixth report contains a number of novelties, but also repeats the same messages that we've been hearing in vain for the last 30 years. So the question is, what will the seventh or the eighth report look like? Can they just be about reducing uncertainties? And I would rather recommend that perhaps the IPCC should evolve towards the production of shorter reports addressing key issues of importance for public decision.
Thank you. I'll take you up on that and essentially say that, there's also our job as people who work in policy circles and think tanks to really convey some key messages by now. One, if we look at the Ukraine crisis, and I think that this is really important to look at this crisis also under the climate lens, we need to realize that climate adaptation and democratic resilience are really two pillars that go hand in hand together. And the second thing, and this is something that I want to drive forward as a key message to EU policymakers, climate transitions today are at the heart of a new geopolitical game, which threatens the stability and the ecological resilience of countries across the world, and particularly of countries that are climate vulnerable and well endowed in those critical materials that we need for decarbonization. So this report that you published yesterday with hundreds of other authors is critical to drive a new vision for foreign policy and to really, drive this point that good adaptation, good mitigation is about international security based on human rights-based approaches and human security.
I'm really hoping that the report will be read not only by climate policymakers, but also, and perhaps most importantly, by foreign policymakers.
I totally agree. And on these good words, and I'm afraid that we have to close, François, as usual, it's been a pleasure. Good luck with all of your round of medias, and see you very soon. And thank you to the audience.
See you soon, Olivia. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Cheers.